The line on a map is a comforting illusion. For most of human history, the edges of empires were not neat boundaries, but vast, living worlds unto themselves. These were the borderlands, and they were the true engines of history. By the end of this journey, you will see the medieval world not as a collection of isolated civilizations, but as a network of these dynamic, creative frontiers where everything was remade. We will travel from the foggy Roman walls to the sun-baked outposts of the Caliphate, into the bustling markets of kingdoms that belonged to no single people. How did a Viking become a Norman knight, and why did a Christian king build a palace in an Islamic style? The answers lie in these spaces of extraordinary blending. What does it really mean for a culture to be pure? To understand these places, we need to set aside our modern maps. Think of a border not as a line, but as a zone, a broad and blurry region where the rules of the homeland begin to bend and fade. Historians call this a borderland. It is a world apart from the settled core of an empire, where the emperor's word is law and culture feels unified. In the core, you know who is in charge, you speak the dominant language, and you follow the expected customs. The borderland is the opposite. It is a place of overlapping claims, where the reach of a distant capital grows thin, and the influence of a neighboring power begins to seep in. Authority here is not a single, clear command, but a tangled web of competing loyalties. A local chieftain might pay tribute to one king while secretly trading with another, and a farmer might speak 3 languages just to get through the market day. This political ambiguity is the defining feature. It is not merely an empty space between 2 solid states. It is a vibrant, contested arena where people constantly negotiate, adapt, and create new ways of life. The borderland is not a barrier, it is a meeting place, a laboratory for identity. So when we talk about the edges of the Roman Empire or the marches of medieval Spain, we are not talking about a fortified wall. We are talking about this living, breathing zone of possibility, where the very question of who you are was always open for negotiation. Perhaps the greatest example of this borderland world was the edge of Rome itself. For centuries, the Roman Empire maintained vast frontier zones known as the limes, pronounced limes, a network of fortifications, watchtowers, and roads stretching from the misty shores of Britain, across the Rhine and Danube rivers, all the way to the deserts of Syria. On a map, it looks like a definitive military barrier, the ultimate line in the sand. But in reality, the limes was one of the most permeable and culturally active borders in history. It was less a wall and more a colossal filtering system, a place where people, goods, and ideas were constantly exchanged. The Roman soldiers stationed in these distant forts did not live in isolation. They were surrounded by local communities, tribes the Romans called Germanic or barbarian, and a bustling economy sprang up to serve the garrison's needs. Traders brought goods from deep within the empire, wine, olive oil, fine pottery, and glassware, which then filtered into local societies. In return, amber, furs, and food supplies flowed into the Roman camps. This was not just smuggling, it was official, regulated trade, a daily acknowledgement that the frontier could not be sealed. The movement of people was just as constant. Young men from across the river, seeking fortune and status, would enlist as auxiliary soldiers in the Roman army. They served for 25 years, earned Roman citizenship, learned Latin, and were steeped in Roman military discipline and technology. When they retired, they often settled near the forts with their families, becoming a permanent blended community. Their sons might grow up speaking a Germanic language at home, but dreaming of a career in the legions. Meanwhile, Roman military tactics and equipment began to change, adopting elements from the very warriors they were meant to keep out. the heavy, rigid legionary formation slowly gave way to more flexible cavalry units, influenced by the fighting styles of frontier peoples. The border was teaching both sides new ways to be, so the limes did not separate Roman from barbarian. Instead, it created a third thing, a hybrid military culture where a commander might have a Roman name and wear a Roman cloak, but his best cavalry captain could be the son of a local chieftain, and the religious rituals in their fort might blend the worship of Jupiter with gods from the northern forests. This was not the fall of Rome, but a slow, profound transformation. The empire's edge was not eroding, it was evolving into something new, setting the stage for the kingdoms that would one day emerge from its shadow. But what happens when an empire fades and the borderland becomes the entire kingdom? For a powerful example, we can look to the Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain and Portugal, in the centuries after Rome's central authority dissolved. This was not a clean break followed by a dark age. Instead, the entire region became a vast internal borderland, a place where layers of identity were constantly being negotiated. The Visigoths, a Germanic people, established a Christian kingdom, but they ruled over a population that was largely Hispano-Roman, people who still saw themselves as the cultural heirs of Rome. This created a fascinating and tense dynamic. The Visigothic kings wanted legitimacy, and to get it, they did not simply impose their own ways, they actively reached back to the Roman past. They adopted Roman law codes, used Roman administrative titles, and even held church councils in the old Roman style to unify religious doctrine. In many ways, they were trying to become more Roman than the Romans themselves to solidify their rule. Meanwhile, in the south, coastal cities like Cartagena remained under the control of the Byzantine Empire, a direct remnant of Rome's eastern half. So within this single peninsula, you had a Visigothic king in Toledo styling himself as a Roman emperor, a local Hispano-Roman landowner who might speak Latin at home but serve a Gothic lord, and a Byzantine governor in the south flying a different imperial banner. Identity here was not a simple choice between Goth and Roman. It was a complex performance. A powerful family might have a Gothic name for political clout, but marry into an old Roman lineage for social prestige. They would worship in the same Christian churches, but the liturgy might carry echoes of older, local traditions that never fully disappeared. This was a borderland of the mind, where the past was not dead but actively used as a tool to navigate the present. The landscape itself was a palimpsest, an ancient manuscript where new text is written over the old, but traces of the previous writing always show through. The Visigoths built their churches on the foundations of Roman temples, and local saints often inherited the stories and sacred sites of much older deities. This long period of blending and rewriting set a profound precedent. It created a society already accustomed to layered identities, to cultural negotiation at the highest levels of power. So when a new force arrived in the early 8th century, one that would sweep away the Visigothic kingdom almost overnight, it did not encounter a monolithic, pure Christian civilization. It stepped into a world that was already a masterpiece of adaptation, a borderland where the ground was perfectly prepared for another extraordinary and even more profound transformation. That new force was Islam. In the early 8th century, armies of the Umayyad Caliphate surged across North Africa and into the Visigothic kingdom, establishing a new power known as Al-Andalus. But the story does not end with a simple conquest and a clean division. For centuries, a different kind of borderland emerged far to the east, one that was even more sharply defined and yet, paradoxically, just as fluid. This was the Thughur, stretching across the rugged highlands of Anatolia and northern Syria. The Thughur was not a vague zone of influence. It was a deliberately constructed, heavily militarized frontier, a deep buffer of fortresses and garrison towns built by both the Byzantine Empire and the successive Islamic caliphates. Think of it as a colossal, double-locked door. Both empires poured immense resources into securing this line, maintaining large standing armies in a state of perpetual readiness. The landscape itself was transformed into a chessboard of stone, with castles, watchtowers, and fortified passes staring directly at each other across contested valleys. This was a place of constant tension where seasonal raids were not just common, they were a way of life, an almost ritualized form of economic and military pressure. Yet, this very intensity of contact forged a unique society. Raids led to prisoners, and prisoners led to exchanges. Over decades, a regular traffic in captives and ransoms developed, meaning soldiers and civilians from both sides spent years living among their so-called enemies. They learned each other's languages, customs, and military tactics. They traded goods during brief truces and observed each other's religious holidays from a distance. The result was a profound, if grudging, familiarity. A Byzantine commander might know the name of the Arab emir in the fortress opposite his, and they might even exchange curt, respectful messages. This was a borderland born of fire and steel, but it bred an intimate knowledge that blurred the very lines the fortifications were meant to draw. Out of this hardened ground grew a legendary figure, the Akrites. These were the frontier warriors of the Byzantine side, often local men recruited from the border provinces themselves. They were not regular legionaries answering to a distant emperor in Constantinople. They were a hybrid breed granted land in exchange for military service, operating with significant autonomy. Their world was the Thughur, and their culture reflected its blended reality. Many were bilingual, fluent in Greek and Arabic. They adopted lighter armor and cavalry tactics from their Arab counterparts, favoring speed and ambush over rigid formations. Their epic songs and poems, the Acritic cycles, are filled with themes of border life, of loyalty tested between local lords and the far-off capital, of raids, captures, and ransoms. In these stories, the hero might have a Greek name and fight for the cross, but his greatest rival across the frontier is often portrayed not as a monster, but as a worthy adversary, a mirror image bound by the same harsh code of honor. The Akrites became the living embodiment of the borderland, men whose primary identity was tied to the march itself, not solely to the empire they nominally served. They were products of a relentless, grinding conflict that, over generations, created a shared culture of the frontier, a strange brotherhood of rivals who understood each other better than their own distant rulers ever could. This was a world where the clash of civilizations, so often imagined as a clean break, was in fact a slow, grinding process of exchange that created something entirely new in the space between. While the Thughur was a border forged in conflict, another frontier emerged where the meeting of worlds sparked an era of breathtaking creativity. This was Al-Andalus, Islamic Iberia, and it became the ultimate cultural crucible of the medieval world. To see it as a simple Arab conquest is to miss its true nature. For centuries, this was a profound and enduring borderland where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish traditions did not merely coexist. They engaged in a sustained, daily conversation that reshaped knowledge itself. Historians often describe this period with a beautiful Spanish word, convivencia, which means living together. It is a tempting picture of perfect harmony, but the reality was far more complex and human. Convivencia was not a utopia free from tension or inequality. It was a pragmatic, often negotiated arrangement, a delicate social contract that allowed these communities to share a space, a marketplace, and a destiny. Within this framework, something extraordinary happened. The city of Toledo, after it came under Christian rule in the 11th century, became the epicenter of an intellectual revolution precisely because of its layered past. Here, in bustling translation workshops, Teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side. A Jewish scholar might translate a philosophical text from Arabic into Castilian Spanish. A Christian cleric would then translate that Spanish into Latin, and a Muslim scholar could be consulted for clarification on a tricky point of Arabic grammar. This was not just moving words from one language to another. It was a collective act of rediscovery and transmission. Through this collaborative effort, the lost works of Aristotle, along with groundbreaking Arabic texts on medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, flowed into Latin Europe, fueling the Renaissance. But the blending was not confined to libraries. In the towns and cities of Al-Andalus, you would find Mozarabic Christians who lived under Muslim rule. Many adopted the Arabic language, dressed in the local style, and even used Arabic formulas in their legal documents, all while maintaining their Christian faith. They were cultural bridges, living examples of adaptation. On the other side were the Muwalladun, local Iberians who converted to Islam and became fully integrated into the governing society, yet often retained their own distinct customs and even their Romance languages. This constant, fluid exchange created an identity that was uniquely Andalusian. An architect might design a mosque with horseshoe arches derived from old Visigothic churches. A poet could compose verses in Arabic that echoed the meter and themes of Romance love songs. The cuisine, the music, the very layout of a home courtyard, all bore the fingerprints of this centuries-long conversation. Al-Andalus was not a place where cultures sat side by side in separate boxes. It was a simmering pot where they melted into one another, creating a rich, new alloy that was neither purely Eastern nor purely European, but something entirely its own. This was the Borderland at its most productive, proving that the edges of empires could be centers of luminous innovation. Far to the northeast of Constantinople, where the forests grew dense and the winters long, another kind of borderland was taking shape. This was the Slavic-Byzantine Frontier, a world not of stone fortresses but of deep rivers, vast woodlands, and emerging kingdoms. Here, the empire's most powerful tool was not the legionary's sword, but the missionary's book and the diplomat's promise. The story of how Byzantium extended its influence into these lands is a masterclass in soft power, the art of winning hearts and minds. It began with language. In the 9th century, two brothers from Thessalonica, Cyril and Methodius, were sent north on a mission. Their task was not to conquer, but to communicate. They understood that to spread the Christian faith, they needed to speak to people in a tongue they could feel in their hearts. So they did something revolutionary. They created a new alphabet, Glagolitic, and later its evolved form, Cyrillic, specifically designed to capture the sounds of the Slavic languages. They translated the Bible and the liturgy into this new written language, Old Church Slavonic. This was not a demand for assimilation, but an invitation to participation. For the Slavic tribes, this gift was transformative. Literacy arrived not as a foreign imposition, but as a key to a spiritual world they could now access directly. It granted them a sacred language of their own, one that would become the foundation of their literary and national identities for centuries to come. The brothers were not just missionaries, they were nation builders in the most profound sense, and their work turned the borderland into a bridge. This cultural bridge became a highway for statecraft. Emerging Slavic and Bulgar rulers saw in Byzantium not just a potential enemy, but a dazzling model of power. A distant emperor in his golden city represented an idea of sacred kingship, of law, and of divinely ordained order that these ambitious leaders wanted for themselves. The conversion of a ruler was never just a personal spiritual decision. It was a supreme political act. When Prince Vladimir of Kievan Rus chose Orthodox Christianity in the late 10th century, he was making a calculated choice about his kingdom's future. He sent emissaries to observe the major faiths, and the splendor of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople reportedly sealed his decision. but his baptism was followed by a marriage alliance with a Byzantine princess, a direct link to imperial prestige. He returned to Kiev with priests, architects, and artists, ordering the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River and commissioning churches modeled on the great domed structures of Byzantium. He was not simply copying, he was translating imperial symbolism into a new context, using faith and art to cement his authority and connect his realm to a wider, civilized world. The same process unfolded in the First Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Boris I and his son, Simon the Great. They accepted Christianity and, crucially, the Slavonic liturgy, allowing a deep fusion of faith and national identity. Simon, educated in Constantinople, declared himself Tsar, a title equal to emperor, and made his capital Preslav, a brilliant center of Slavic literature and art. In these kingdoms, we see the borderland logic in its most potent form. Byzantine influence was not swallowed whole. It was selectively adopted, adapted, and remixed. Local rulers took the pieces they needed, the religion, the legal concepts, the artistic styles, and wove them together with their own traditions to forge something entirely new, a royal identity that was both orthodox and distinctly their own. The mosaic icons in Kiev's cathedral might follow Byzantine technique, but the faces of the saints could take on local features. The chronicles written in Slavonic told the story not of Rome or Constantinople, but of the Slavic people themselves, now framed within a Christian understanding of history. This was the ultimate transformation of a frontier. Through this deliberate, creative borrowing, these borderland principalities did not remain peripheral outposts. They internalized the imperial model and used it to build their own cores of civilization, powerful kingdoms that would define Eastern Europe for a millennium. The Edge had become a new center, proving once more that the most lasting empires are often those built not by force, but by the power of an idea patiently offered across a cultural frontier. While the Byzantine model worked through cultural invitation, another empire took a far more direct approach to its frontiers. The Carolingian Empire, forged by Charlemagne in the heart of Europe, viewed its borderlands not just as zones of contact, but as instruments of power. These were the Marches, militarized buffer regions commanded by trusted counts or dukes, and their purpose was twofold: to defend the core and to systematically expand its influence. Yet the methods and results differed dramatically depending on which frontier you stood upon. In the south, facing the power of Al-Andalus, lay the Marca Hispanica, the Spanish March. Established after Frankish forces pushed into the eastern Pyrenees, this was a land of strategic fortresses and resettlement. Charlemagne encouraged Christians from his northern territories to move into these contested valleys, granting them land in exchange for military service. This was a project of cultural reclamation, an attempt to plant a loyal, Frankish-oriented society on the doorstep of Islamic Iberia. Towns like Barcelona became fortified outposts, and over generations, a new society crystallized here, one that was officially Christian and Frankish in its political allegiance, yet inevitably shaped by its proximity to the sophisticated culture of Al-Andalus. The local aristocracy, the Counts of the March, held immense autonomous power, governing these distant territories with a practical eye. Their loyalty to a distant emperor was often balanced by the daily realities of border life, which could include trade, temporary truces, and a cautious respect for their formidable neighbors. This created a frontier nobility with a hybrid identity, Frankish in name and faith, but uniquely Catalan in its emerging character. The story on the empire's northeastern frontier was starkly different. Here, against the pagan Saxon tribes, Charlemagne waged a decades-long campaign of brutal subjugation. The Saxon marches were not zones of resettlement, but of forced integration. The objective was not merely military victory, but the complete eradication of Saxon pagan identity and its replacement with Frankish Christian rule. This was a policy of uncompromising assimilation, marked by harsh laws that mandated baptism and punished pagan practices with severe penalties. The famous capitulary on the Saxons decreed death for anyone who showed disrespect to a church or a priest. It was a deliberate and often violent project of cultural erasure. To secure this hard-won territory, Charlemagne installed a new loyal aristocracy, granting vast tracts of Saxon land to Frankish nobles and to those Saxon leaders who submitted and converted. These new lords, the Margraves, were the empire's strongmen on a dangerous frontier, but their position created fascinating contradictions. A Frankish Margrave, ruling over a largely Saxon population, needed local allies to maintain order. He might marry his daughter to a baptized Saxon chieftain's son, blending lineages. A Saxon noble who had converted to keep his lands now served a Frankish emperor, leading troops who spoke a different language. Over time, these families on the razor's edge developed their own interests. Their power was rooted in the march itself, in their control of border castles and their private armies. Their primary loyalty could shift from the distant emperor to the preservation of their own regional dynasty. They became neither fully Frankish nor purely Saxon, but a new political breed, the frontier aristocrat, whose identity was forged in the garrison and defined by the land he held through force and negotiation. In both marches, whether through the patient ceding of the Spanish march or the fierce hammer blows of the Saxon frontier, the Carolingian Empire succeeded in expanding its borders, but at a profound cost. It created powerful regional actors whose mixed loyalties would, within a few generations, fuel the fragmentation of the empire itself. The very tools used to build the frontier ultimately reshaped the center, proving once again that the edges of power are where empires are both made and unmade. The sea was their highway, not their boundary. While empires built walls on land, the Vikings mastered a different kind of frontier, a maritime borderland that spanned continents. Their story is often told through the dramatic lens of raid and plunder, but the deeper legacy lies in what they built after the longships beached. From the stormy North Atlantic to the river roads of Eastern Europe, Norse settlers did not just conquer territory, they entered into a profound negotiation with it, creating hybrid societies that would redirect the course of history. This was not a simple transplanting of Scandinavian culture. It was a breathtakingly rapid process of adaptation and reinvention. In each new land, they became something else entirely. Take the Danelaw, the vast region of eastern and northern England settled by Norse armies in the 9th century. Here, the Vikings were not just occupiers, they were neighbors and eventually kin. A peace treaty divided the island between the English king Alfred and the Viking leader Guthrum, but the border between them was porous. Trade, intermarriage, and daily contact blurred the lines of conflict. The Norse settlers adopted the local language, but they transformed it, pouring hundreds of their own words into the pot of Old English. Words for everyday things like sky and leg, window and knife are Norse gifts to the language. They blended their legal customs with English common law, and their intricate art styles began to weave into local manuscript illumination. Within a generation or two, a child in York might have a Norse grandfather but pray in an English church and speak a tongue that was neither purely one nor the other, but a new, robust ancestor of modern English. This was a borderland etched not on soil but in speech and custom. Across the Channel, a similar transformation unfolded on an even grander political scale. In the early 10th century, the Frankish king Charles the Simple, desperate to secure his coastline, made a pragmatic deal with a Viking war and led by Rollo. He granted them the lands around the Seine River, what became Normandy, in exchange for their loyalty and their defense against other Viking raids. Rollo and his men converted to Christianity, swore fealty to the Frankish king, and married into the local Frankish aristocracy. But they did not disappear. They absorbed the Frankish language, the feudal structure, and the religion with a fierce, transformative energy. What emerged was not a Scandinavian colony, but the Normans, a new people forged in this coastal borderland. They kept the Norse talent for maritime organization and audacious warfare, but channeled it through the framework of Frankish cavalry and castle-based lordship. Within a century and a half, these Normans would not only conquer England, they would carve out kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily, acting as a dynamic, hybrid force that reshaped medieval Europe. Their power was born on the frontier. Perhaps the most astonishing metamorphosis occurred far to the east, along the river networks leading to Constantinople and the Black Sea. Norse traders and adventurers, known as the Rus, navigated these waterways, establishing trading posts at Novgorod and Kiev. They did not come as a massive army, but as a ruling elite seeking luxury goods and tribute. To govern the vast Slavic populations, they had to adapt. Just as Rollo in Normandy adopted Frankish ways, the Rus princes like Vladimir adopted the language, customs, and decisively, the Orthodox Christianity of their subjects and their powerful Byzantine neighbors. The ruling dynasty became Slavic in culture, their Norse origins fading into founding legends. The polity they created, Kievan Rus, was a Slavic kingdom with a Scandinavian skeleton, a direct product of this riverine borderland where northern traders became eastern princes. In every case, from Danelaw to Normandy to Rus, the pattern holds. The Vikings were ultimate borderland people. They possessed a core identity, but it was not rigid, it was a toolkit for adaptation. They leveraged their maritime mobility to insert themselves into new societies, and then, with remarkable flexibility, they shed their old skin and put on a new one, blending with the local landscape to create something unprecedented. Their legacy is not a Viking Europe, but a Europe profoundly shaped by the hybrid cultures they became. The Normans, the Rus, the Anglo-Scandinavian society of the Danelaw, these were the true fruits of the Viking Age, proving that the most enduring conquests are not of land, but of identity. The Normans became the ultimate shape-shifters of the medieval world. They stand as the clearest proof that a borderland is not a place of weakness, but a forge for a new kind of power. Their story begins with that pragmatic treaty on the banks of the Seine, where Norse raiders became Frankish vassals. But the real magic happened in the generations that followed, in the quiet, daily work of becoming something else. They did not cling to their past. They shed their Norse language like an old cloak, embracing the Romance dialect of their new home, which would evolve into Norman French. They converted to Christianity not as a superficial political gesture, but with a fervor that saw them founding monasteries and becoming generous patrons of the church. Most significantly, they mastered the dominant military technology of the continent, the armored knight and the castle. They absorbed the Frankish system of feudal cavalry and then refined it into an instrument of breathtaking efficiency. Within a century, you could not tell a Norman lord from a Frankish one by his dress, his speech, or his faith. Yet something fundamental had changed. The old Viking appetite for risk, for organization over vast distances, and for seizing opportunity had not vanished, it had been repackaged. The restless energy of the raider was now channeled through the disciplined structure of the knight. This created a potent and volatile hybrid, a warrior aristocracy that was culturally French but possessed a frontier mentality, always looking for the next horizon. This borderland-born identity is what made their explosive expansion possible. When Duke William claimed the English throne in 1066, he was not leading a Viking fleet. He was commanding a feudal army of knights and archers, but the logistical feat of building a fleet and transporting it across the Channel echoed the maritime prowess of his ancestors. In England, they imposed a new French-speaking elite, building stone castles to dominate the landscape, yet they also adopted and adapted the sophisticated Anglo-Saxon system of royal administration, creating a stronger, more centralized state. The same pattern repeated in the Mediterranean. Norman adventurers, initially arriving as pilgrims or mercenaries, saw the political fragmentation of southern Italy and Sicily, a land contested between Byzantine Greeks, Lombard princes, and Muslim emirs. They did not come as a unified invasion force, but as small bands of ambitious knights, the ultimate borderland opportunists. Through a mix of ruthless warfare, shrewd diplomacy, and strategic marriages, they stitched together a kingdom. And here their adaptive genius shone brightest. In their new Sicilian capital of Palermo, they did not impose a monoculture. Instead, they created a brilliant, trilingual court where Arabic, Greek, and Latin were all used in administration. They employed Muslim architects to design their palaces, where rooms were adorned with Islamic style, muqarnas ceilings, and gardens fed by ingenious irrigation systems. They commissioned Byzantine mosaicists to cover their chapels in golden depictions of Christ, creating some of the finest art of the age. The Norman kings of Sicily styled themselves as Basilius, Emperor, and Sultan, weaving together the symbolic threads of all the cultures they ruled. They became, in effect, the perfect borderland monarchs, governing a crossroads of civilizations by embodying its diversity. This same adaptable, militarized template was then deployed to the ultimate borderland project, the Crusader states. In the Levant, Norman and French knights became the ruling class of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch. They built castles that blended European design with local defensive lessons, and their legal codes, the Assizes of Jerusalem, attempted to create a new feudal order in a foreign land. Their entire history is a cascade of borderlands, from the shores of Normandy to the hills of Palestine, each conquest fueled by an identity forged in the space between worlds. The Normans teach us that the most dynamic forces in history are often these cultural alloys, born on the edges, tempered by necessity, and sharp enough to reshape continents. Yet while the Normans mastered the art of cultural blending, another frontier was being forged with a very different purpose. To the northeast of the German heartlands, beyond the Elbe River, stretched a vast and ancient world of dense forests, amber coasts, and powerful pagan tribes. This was the Baltic frontier, and for Latin Christendom, it represented the final, untamed edge of Europe. What unfolded here over 3 centuries was not a quick conquest, but a slow, grinding process that would reshape the map and the very identity of a continent. It began with a call not just for conversion, but for a permanent crusade. In the late 12th century, Pope Celestine III authorized a perpetual campaign against the pagan peoples of the northeast, offering the same spiritual rewards as a journey to Jerusalem. This launched the Northern Crusades, a complex fusion of holy war, territorial expansion, and colonization that would echo for generations. Unlike the dynamic exchange in Al-Andalus, the stated goal here was not coexistence, but a fundamental overwriting of the old world. Primary agents of this change were not kings, but military orders, most famously the Teutonic Knights. Originally founded in the Holy Land, they redirected their entire mission to this northern wilderness. Through relentless campaigning, they carved out their own sovereign state, a unique and fearsome entity known as the Ordensstaat, or Order State. This was a militarized theocracy, a society run by warrior monks who answered only to the Pope and their own Grand Master. Their land, encompassing what is now parts of Poland, Kaliningrad, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, was a borderland engineered from the top down. They dotted the landscape with stark brick fortresses, symbols of a new, rigid order imposed upon the forest. Yet, to secure their conquest, the order could not rely on force alone. They needed people, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants to make their state viable. This triggered the Great Eastward Movement, the Ostsiedlung. Thousands of German settlers were encouraged with promises of land and greater freedoms to move into these new territories. They established towns governed by German law, like Lübeck law or Magdeburg law, which offered self-government and economic privileges unheard of in many older feudal regions. These towns, such as Riga, Tallinn, and Königsberg, became islands of German language and custom, hubs of the Hanseatic trade network that connected the Baltic to the wider world. The indigenous Baltic peoples, the Prussians, Livonians, and others, faced a stark choice. Their societies were dismantled, their sacred groves cut down, their gods denounced. Many were subjugated, reduced to a serf class on lands they once owned. Others were gradually assimilated, converting to Christianity, and over generations adopting the German language and ways to access the economic and social advantages of the new order. The result was not a simple replacement, but a deeply layered and unequal society. A rigid hierarchy crystallized, with German-speaking nobles and burghers at the top, a Slavic-Polish nobility in regions like Pomerania, and a largely peasant Baltic underclass. This created a brittle frontier identity, one defined by legal privilege and ethnicity rather than the fluid blending seen elsewhere. The Teutonic Order state itself became a borderland power, but of a different kind. It was permanently poised between worlds, facing external pressure from the rising kingdom of Poland-Lithuania and internal tension from its own complex social fabric. Its very existence was a monument to the crusading ideal, but its daily reality was one of administration, trade, and fragile control over a conquered population. The legacy of this centuries-long process is a palimpsest written in conflict. The old Baltic languages and pagan beliefs were largely erased, surviving only in fragments of folklore and place names. The region was irrevocably tied into the economic and cultural sphere of Central Europe, yet the social divisions sown by the Ostsiedlung created fractures that would resonate painfully into the modern era. Here, the borderland was not a space of mutual creation, but a contested ground where one vision of civilization was systematically, and often violently, imposed upon another, leaving behind a landscape of layered memories and identities that were difficult to reconcile. But beyond the dense forests of the Baltic lay a frontier of an entirely different scale, an ocean of grass where the rules of history were written on horseback. The Eurasian steppe was the ultimate borderland, a vast ecological and cultural zone stretching from the borders of China to the gates of Hungary. Here, the dynamic was not between rival empires, but between two fundamentally different ways of life. On one side were the great sedentary civilizations, Byzantium, China, the Rus principalities with their walled cities, written laws, and plowed fields. On the other were the nomadic confederations, the Huns, Avars, Magyars, and later the Mongols, whose wealth was measured in herds and whose power flowed from mobility. This was not a static line, but a pulsating, living membrane where these two worlds met, clashed, and endlessly transformed each other. Historians describe a fascinating pattern here called the Shadow Empire. A powerful steppe confederation rarely formed in a vacuum. It often coalesced precisely in reaction to a wealthy, organized sedentary state. The immense wealth of China or Persia acted like a magnet, pulling disparate nomadic tribes together under a single, charismatic leader who could organize raids and, more importantly, negotiate lucrative trade agreements or tribute payments. The steppe polity existed in a state of symbiotic tension with its settled neighbor, its political structure often mirroring the complexity of the empire it faced. They were shadows, yes, but shadows cast by a brilliant fire, dependent on its light for their very form. The exchange across this grassy border was constant and profound. From the settled world, nomads sought luxury goods, silk, grain, and finely crafted metalwork, especially tools and weapons, but they were not passive recipients. They were brilliant innovators in military technology, perfecting the composite bow, a weapon of stunning power and range crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew. They mastered the use of the stirrup, which allowed a rider to stand and fire with deadly accuracy or deliver a crushing lance blow, revolutionizing cavalry warfare. These technologies did not stay on the steppe. They filtered into the settled empires, forcing them to adapt their own armies, often by hiring nomadic mercenaries who then brought their customs with them. Political ideas flowed both ways. A steppe Khan might adopt the title and ceremonial trappings of a Chinese emperor to bolster his authority, while a Byzantine diplomat would learn the intricate clan politics of the steppe to secure an alliance. The Rus princes, themselves products of a Norse-Slavic blend, became experts in dealing with the steppe peoples, paying tribute one year and marrying a Khan's daughter the next to secure their vulnerable southern frontier. This was a borderland defined by ecological difference, but it thrived on mutual need. The nomads provided horses, furs, and military prowess. The settled lands offered textiles, grain, and manufactured goods. Their relationship was a perpetual dance of raid, trade, treaty, and intermarriage, creating a hybrid political culture along the frontier. A fortress town on the edge of the steppe might be populated by a mix of Slavic farmers, Greek traders, and Turkic horsemen in the garrison, all coexisting in a fragile equilibrium maintained by a shared understanding of the power that roamed just beyond the horizon. The steppe frontier reminds us that the most enduring borders are not those that separate, but those that connect fundamentally different worlds, forcing each to change in the process. The steppe's ultimate shadow empire would eclipse them all. In the 13th century, the Mongol conquests arrived not as another wave from the grasslands, but as a continental storm. For the settled civilizations and the older borderlands in their path, it was a period of immense hardship. Yet, from this rupture emerged a paradox, a single, sprawling imperial network that forcibly stitched together the entire Eurasian world. The Mongols did not just conquer territories, they connected them, creating a new reality where the borderlands of Rome, Islam, China, and the Rus were suddenly part of the same political and economic system. This era of enforced peace under their rule is known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was peace maintained by overwhelming force, but its effects were revolutionary. For the first time in history, a merchant could travel with relative security from the ports of the Black Sea all the way to the capital of China, a journey of over 5,000 miles. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, with its relay stations and fresh horses, created an information superhighway for imperial officials that also served traders and travelers. Ideas and inventions began to move with the caravans. Chinese innovations like gunpowder, the compass, and printing techniques traveled westward. Persian astronomical knowledge and Islamic medical texts flowed east. This was a great acceleration of the slow blending that had always characterized frontier zones, now supercharged by imperial design. But the Mongols themselves were transformed by the worlds they ruled. The empire quickly fractured into four major khanates, each adapting to its local borderland context. In the west, the Golden Horde, ruling over the Rus principalities and the Pontic steppe, underwent a profound cultural shift. While maintaining their nomadic elite lifestyle on the steppe, the Horde's rulers increasingly adopted Islam for administration and diplomacy, deepening the Islamic influence throughout Eastern Europe. Cities like Sarai on the Volga River became cosmopolitan hubs where Russian princes came to pay tribute, Italian merchants from Genoa set up trading posts, and Islamic scholars worked alongside Mongol administrators. The older Slavic-Byzantine frontier now had to negotiate with a new, powerful steppe power that was itself becoming Persianate and Islamic in character. Similarly, in the Ilkhanate of Persia, Mongol rulers eventually converted to Islam and patronized magnificent Persian art and architecture, blending steppe traditions with Islamic high culture. The Pax Mongolica did not erase local identities. Instead, it placed them all within a new, shared framework of exchange. It reshaped the very geography of blending, turning the entire interior of Eurasia into one vast, interconnected borderland. The routes they secured would outlast their empire, setting the stage for the next great chapter of global connection, and reminding us that sometimes the most profound unifications arise from the most unexpected and disruptive forces. The world the Mongols connected was vast, but the power of a borderland is that it can be just as transformative on a smaller, more intimate scale. Consider the Irish Sea in the 9th and 10th centuries. This was not a barrier, but a bustling Celtic and Norse highway, a maritime borderland where a different kind of fusion took root. Norse longships did not just raid the rich monasteries of Ireland, they began to stay, establishing fortified trading towns at Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. These were not isolated colonies, they were new nodes in an ancient seafaring network. From these bases, Norse influence rippled out to the Isle of Man and down the western coasts of Scotland, weaving into the fabric of Gaelic society. What emerged here was not a simple story of conquest, but of deep cultural entanglement, creating dynasties and art that belonged to both worlds. The political landscape became a patchwork of hybrid kingdoms. The Kingdom of Dublin, for a time, was a powerful Norse-Gaelic entity, its rulers often bearing Norse names but speaking the Irish language and marrying into the families of local Irish kings. Their power depended on controlling trade routes across the sea, not on dominating the Irish interior. Similarly, on the Isle of Man and in the Hebrides, a mixed Norse-Gaelic aristocracy emerged. These were the Gael Gaedhail, a term meaning foreign Gaels, who were as comfortable navigating by Norse stars as they were reciting Gaelic poetry. Their loyalty was to the sea itself and the wealth it brought. This blending reached its most spectacular form in art. Look at a high cross from the Isle of Man from this period. You will see the classic interlaced patterns of Celtic art, the same swirling vines and intricate knots found in the Book of Kells. But look closer, and woven into that design are figures from Norse mythology, scenes of Sigurd the dragon slayer or the great wolf Fenrir. The stone itself is a conversation, a masterwork created by sculptors who understood both symbolic languages and saw no contradiction in bringing them together. This artistic fusion reflected a lived reality. In places like the Hebrides, the lordship of the Isles would later arise, a semi-independent maritime lordship whose rulers traced their lineage to both Norse sea kings and Gaelic clan chiefs. Their court poets composed in Gaelic, but their warships were of Norse design. Their law was a blend of Celtic custom and Norse maritime code. They governed a world where a fisherman might have a Norse nickname, pray to a Celtic saint, and use a silver coin minted in Dublin that bore the name of a Norse king written in Arabic script, a relic of trade networks that stretched across the known world. This Irish Sea borderland shows us that hybridity did not require the grand architecture of an empire. It could flourish in the spaces between, on the decks of ships, and in the stone of a country churchyard, where daily contact and mutual interest forged a new culture that was entirely its own, a testament to the creative power of the coastal frontier. Language itself is the ultimate artifact of the borderland, a living record of every conversation, every trade, and every shared street. While kings sign treaties and empires rise and fall, the words people use in their daily lives tell a deeper, more intimate story of contact. When cultures meet and blend, their languages do not simply collide, they dance, borrowing, adapting, and creating something new in the process. This linguistic blending is our most direct evidence of how borderlands truly worked, revealing the hidden networks of power, commerce, and ordinary life that official histories often miss. Consider the humble pidgin. These are simplified languages that spring up almost overnight in trading ports or frontier markets where people who share no common tongue need to do business. They are not the full, rich language of a homeland, but a practical toolkit of nouns, verbs, and gestures. A pidgin is a borderland in verbal form, a temporary, functional space for exchange. If that contact becomes permanent, If communities settle side by side and raise children, those children often transform the pidgin into a full, complex language known as a Creole. This is a brand new linguistic identity born directly from the necessity of the frontier. But more common than the birth of entirely new languages is the profound borrowing of words, a process called lexical borrowing. These loanwords are like linguistic fossils, each one telling a story of what was traded, admired, or needed. Look at Spanish. After centuries of conviventure in Al-Andalus, the Spanish language absorbed thousands of words from Arabic, often beginning with al, the Arabic definite article. Think of everyday terms like azúcar, sugar, algodón, cotton, and alfombra, carpet. These are not obscure terms, they are words for fundamental things, revealing how deeply Islamic knowledge and material culture seeped into daily Iberian life, from agriculture and mathematics to domestic comfort. The borderland left its mark in the very syllables people spoke. The same process reshaped English not once but twice. The Viking settlements of the Danelaw poured Old Norse words directly into the bloodstream of Old English. They were often short, forceful, everyday words like sky, skin, leg, window, knife, and even the pronouns they and them. This was the language of farmers, sailors, and neighbors living cheek by jowl, blending their lives so thoroughly that their speech became inseparable. Centuries later, the Norman conquest imposed a French-speaking elite, and for a time, England was a linguistic borderland. Anglo-Saxon peasants raised cows, sheep, and pigs in the fields, using the Germanic words for these animals. But when the meat reached the table of their Norman lord, it was called beef from boef, pork from pork, and mutton from mountain. English absorbed a vast layer of French and Latin vocabulary, especially for law, government, art, and cuisine, creating the rich, layered language we know today. Each wave of words maps a different kind of borderland relationship, from the horizontal blending of Norse settlers to the vertical imposition of Norman rule. Sometimes the linguistic change was even more deliberate and transformative. Recall the work of Cyril and Methodius on the Slavic-Byzantine Frontier. They did not merely borrow words, they engineered a new literary language, Old Church Slavonic, by adapting the Greek alphabet to Slavic sounds. This was a political and spiritual act, creating a sacred language that granted the Slavic peoples direct access to Christianity without having to submit to Greek or Latin linguistic dominance. It was a gift that forged national identities, proving that in the borderland, language could be both a bridge and a banner. Every loanword, every grammatical shift, is a silent witness to a moment of contact. They tell us what one culture valued enough to take from another, be it a new technology, a luxurious fabric, a legal concept, or a staple food. The language of a borderland is never pure. It is a palimpsest of all the voices that have met there, a conversation that continues long after the forts have crumbled and the maps have been redrawn. Where faith met the frontier, it rarely remained unchanged. In the quiet corners of newly converted lands, far from the eyes of bishops and caliphs, religion performed its own kind of blending. Borderlands, those zones of cultural overlap, became natural laboratories for belief, where official doctrines encountered ancient local spirits and a powerful, grassroots form of adaptation took hold. This process is called syncretism, the merging of different religious traditions into something new, and it was the lived reality for countless people on the edges of empires. In places like the Celtic fringe of Britain or the Norse settlements of Scandinavia, Christianity did not arrive into an empty spiritual landscape. It entered a world already dense with sacred groves, animistic spirits, and deities tied to the land itself. The conversion of a king might decree a new state religion, but it could not erase a farmer's deep connection to the spring that watered his fields or the standing stone where his ancestors made offerings. So a fascinating negotiation occurred. Missionaries, often wise to local sentiment, made strategic accommodations. They would build their churches directly on top of older pagan holy sites, literally repurposing the sacred geography. The festival of a local god might be gently rebranded as the feast day of a Christian saint, with the bonfires and communal gatherings continuing under a new name. In Scandinavia, elements of the Old Norse worldview, like the great world tree Yggdrasil, sometimes found echoes in the imagery of the cross as a tree of life. This was not a failure of faith, but its practical, daily application. People were not simply replacing one set of beliefs with another. They were weaving the new into the familiar fabric of the old, creating a Christianity that felt rooted in their own soil. This local flavor often crystallized around the veneration of saints. In the Borderlands, saints frequently became the Christian face of much older forces. A saint might be associated with a healing well that had been sacred for millennia. Their life story, often embellished with local folklore, could incorporate motifs from pre-Christian myths. These saints became the special patrons of a region, their cults fiercely local and deeply tied to the landscape, offering a form of spiritual identity that was both universally Christian and uniquely theirs. This grassroots blending often made distant Orthodox authorities deeply uneasy. From Rome or Constantinople, these borderland practices could look like superstition or worse, heresy. Church councils would issue decrees against lingering pagan customs, and bishops would be sent to reform local practices, trying to pull these vibrant, hybrid expressions of faith back toward a standardized, universal model. It was a constant tension between the center's desire for uniformity and the periphery's creative adaptation to local reality. This dance was not confined to the pagan Christian frontier. In the sophisticated world of Al-Andalus, theological interaction was more intellectual but no less profound. While mass conversion was not the goal, the close quarters of convivencia sparked deep debates. Christian theologians like Peter Alfonsi engaged directly with Islamic and Jewish thought, using Arabic philosophical concepts to refine their own arguments. Muslim scholars studied the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Gospels, not just to critique them, but to understand the people of the book. This was a borderland of the mind where faiths conversed, compared, and in the process often deepened their own self-understanding. The Crusader states presented a more paradoxical picture. Here, Latin Christian rulers imposed themselves as a foreign elite atop a population of Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews. For survival and administration, they had to engage. Frankish lords employed Arab doctors, made treaties with Muslim emirs, and their legal codes occasionally absorbed local customs. In daily life, a sort of pragmatic coexistence emerged, even as the overarching ideology was one of holy war. Some crusaders adopted elements of local dress, cuisine, and hygiene, while Eastern Christian communities sometimes adopted Latin liturgical practices to curry favor with their new rulers. It was a messy, inconsistent, and often contradictory borderland, where the rigid ideals of the cross met the flexible realities of shared land. In every case, from the Celtic well to the Andalusian debate hall, the borderland demonstrated that faith is not a static artifact, but a living tradition that adapts as it travels. It absorbs the colors of its new environment, taking on the concerns, hopes, and memories of the people who embrace it. The religious map of the medieval world was not painted in solid, unblended colors, but in a million subtle shades of mixture, each one telling a story of meeting, negotiation, and transformation at the edge. But what rules govern these worlds of blending? In the borderlands, law was not a single, rigid code handed down from a distant capital. It was a practical toolkit, a living system that had to make sense for the people actually living in these mixed communities. The result was legal pluralism, where multiple sets of rules coexisted, overlapped, and sometimes merged to create entirely new forms of justice tailored to the frontier. This was not chaos, it was sophisticated, pragmatic adaptation. Take the Danelaw in England. When Norse settlers and Anglo-Saxons agreed to divide the island, they did not impose one law on the other. Instead, the Danelaw region operated under its own distinct legal customs, heavily influenced by Norse traditions. These laws dealt with things like compensation for injuries, property disputes, and the procedures for forming a town council. They were often more communal and focused on arbitration than the royal decrees coming from the English South. A local court in York might weigh a case using a blend of Norse customary law and older Anglo-Saxon practices, creating a hybrid legal culture that reflected the blended population sitting on its benches. This system acknowledged a simple truth that people who live together need rules they all understand and accept, even if those rules come from different sources. A similar but more deliberate legal innovation occurred on the Christian frontier in Iberia. As kings slowly pushed south during the Reconquista, they faced a problem. The newly captured lands were empty and vulnerable. To secure these border zones, they needed to attract settlers quickly. Their solution was the furo. A furo was a royal charter granted to a town, a package of special privileges and local laws designed to be irresistible. It promised settlers things like freedom from certain taxes, the right to elect their own local officials, and clear, favorable laws regarding property and inheritance. These charters were advertisements for a new life, and they worked. Towns like Teruel and Cuenca flourished under their furos, which often incorporated elements of both older Visigothic law and local Muslim commercial practices to create a workable system for a diverse population. The furo did not impose a uniform kingdom-wide law. It created a localized legal identity for a frontier community, a bargain between the crown and its subjects on the dangerous edge of the world. Perhaps the most sophisticated form of legal pluralism existed in the Mediterranean borderlands, particularly under Islamic rule and in places like Norman Sicily. Here, the governing principle was often personal law. Instead of one territorial law for everyone, individuals were judged according to the legal tradition of their own religious community. A Muslim would have their case heard in a Sharia court by a Qadi. A Jew would take a dispute to a rabbinical court operating under halakhic law. A Christian might be subject to canon law in church matters or to remnants of Roman law in others. This system, known as the millet system in the later Ottoman Empire, was a brilliant administrative solution for governing multi-ethnic empires. It allowed for social cohesion by giving each community autonomy over its own personal affairs, like marriage, divorce, and inheritance, while the state maintained control over criminal law and security. In the bustling market of Palermo, a contract dispute between a Muslim merchant and a Jewish trader might be settled by a panel that included experts in both commercial traditions. This was not mere tolerance, it was a highly functional legal ecosystem that recognized difference as a fact of life and built a structure to manage it. In all these examples, from England to Sicily, the law of the borderland was flexible, negotiated, and deeply local. It shows us that the most effective governance in mixed societies was often the kind that did not insist on a single, pure truth, but instead created space for multiple truths to coexist under a shared framework of order. The legal codes that emerged were not compromises but innovations, born from the daily necessity of making life work at the crossroads of the world. Stone and mortar can speak the language of the borderland more clearly than any chronicle. When cultures meet and blend, they do not just exchange words or laws, they build, and in the process, they create a new visual grammar that tells a story of shared imagination. The architecture and art that emerged from these frontier zones are not mere curiosities. They are permanent records of a conversation, often commissioned by powerful elites who understood that projecting a hybrid identity was a source of strength, not confusion. Consider the churches built in northern Iberia during the centuries of Christian expansion southward. In places like Leon and Castile, rulers who had just reclaimed territory from Muslim rule made a fascinating choice. They commissioned churches like San Miguel de Escalada, built in the 10th century by monks fleeing Al-Andalus. These structures are known as Mozarabic churches, and they are a perfect architectural embodiment of the borderland. From the outside, they might look like typical early medieval churches, but step inside. The arches are not the round Romanesque arches of France. They are elegant horseshoe arches, a defining feature of Islamic architecture. The intricate, geometric patterns carved into the capitals and friezes do not depict saints or biblical scenes, but abstract vegetal and knotwork designs that echo the aniconic art of the mosque. Why would a Christian king, fresh from military campaigns against Islamic powers, allow such a visibly Islamic style into his holy spaces? The answer is prestige and legitimacy. These rulers were not just conquering land, they were inheriting a legacy of sophistication. By incorporating these advanced artistic forms, they were signaling that they were not backward northerners, but worthy heirs to the refined culture of Al-Andalus. The building itself became a statement, a declaration that the new kingdom was a blend of martial victory and cultured wisdom, a hybrid identity carved in stone. Far to the north, a different synthesis was taking shape in Normandy. The Romanesque architecture that flourished there in the 11th century, best seen in the majestic abbey of Jumiges, did not spring from a vacuum. It was a masterful fusion. It took the solid, massive forms of late Carolingian and Attentian architecture from the Germanic heartlands and blended them with local building techniques and a newfound sense of vertical aspiration. The Normans, ever the adapters, absorbed the architectural language of the Frankish world they had entered, but then they refined it, made it grander and more imposing. The thick walls, the rounded arches, the towering nave, all spoke of stability and spiritual ambition. This style, born on the Norman frontier, would then be exported with devastating effect. When William the Conqueror built the Tower of London and countless castles across England, he was not just building fortifications, he was stamping the landscape with a Norman aesthetic of power, an aesthetic that was itself a product of earlier blending. The architecture was a tool of conquest, but its form was a testament to the borderland origins of the conquerors. For a truly breathtaking example of artistic fusion, we must look to the ancient Silk Road, to the region of Gandhara in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. Here, in the centuries after Alexander the Great's campaigns, Greek culture met Buddhist spirituality in a prolonged and peaceful borderland exchange. The result was Greco-Buddhist art. For the first time, artists began to depict the Buddha in human form. And how did they depict him? He often bore the serene, idealized features of a Greek god, with wavy hair tied in a topknot, and his robes draped in the realistic, flowing folds of a Greek toga or chiton. The architectural settings for these sculptures used Greek columns and pediments. This was not a random mix, it was a deliberate and profound synthesis. Greek artistic techniques, honed on depicting the human body as a thing of beauty, were applied to the expression of Buddhist concepts of enlightenment and compassion. The hybrid style made the spiritual message accessible and resonant for a population familiar with Hellenistic culture, helping Buddhism spread along the trade routes into Central and East Asia. In each case, from the horseshoe arch in Leon to the Greek-style Buddha in Gandhara, the material culture does something remarkable. It freezes a moment of creative dialogue. These buildings and statues were expensive, requiring the patronage of kings, monks, and merchants. By funding them, these elites were making a conscious choice about how they wanted to be seen. They were crafting a public identity that acknowledged multiple roots, that claimed the best of both worlds. The stone itself became a diplomat, speaking a visual language that all who saw it could understand, a permanent testament to the fact that on the frontier, the most powerful statement you could make was to belong to more than one world at once. These hybrid cultures were not created by faceless forces, but by specific people who learned to master the space between worlds. In every borderland, a unique social class rose to power, one that did not simply inherit their status, but earned it by becoming indispensable brokers. These were the frontier elites, the warlords, local lords, and military commanders whose entire existence was built upon the ambiguity of the march. Their power was not drawn from the heart of an empire, but from their expert control of its outermost edges. They were the ultimate middlemen, and their loyalty was a currency they spent wisely. Consider the Byzantine Akrati once more. These were not ordinary soldiers following orders from Constantinople. They were landowners granted estates along the Thughur in exchange for military service. Their wealth and influence came directly from the frontier itself, from the land they defended and the trade routes they partially controlled. An Akrite chieftain might officially serve the emperor, but his true power base was local, built on networks of kinship with other border families and a pragmatic understanding with his Arab counterpart across the valley. He could levy his own troops, administer local justice, and his primary concern was the security and prosperity of his own strip of contested territory. His loyalty to the distant capital was conditional, a bargain that could be renegotiated if imperial support wavered or a better offer came from the other side. This fluidity was not seen as treason, but as the necessary pragmatism of border life. His value to the empire was precisely his deep local knowledge and his ability to navigate the blurred lines that imperial bureaucrats in Constantinople could scarcely comprehend. A similar dynamic played out with the Norman knights in southern Italy. They arrived not as a unified army under a single duke, but as small, ambitious bands of warriors seeking fortune. A knight like Robert Guiscard, whose name meant the cunning, began as a mercenary with a handful of followers. His power grew not through a royal title, but through his skill as a broker in a fragmented landscape. He played Lombard princes against Byzantine generals, offered his services to the Pope, and sealed alliances through strategic marriages. His authority was entirely personal, built on a reputation for military success and a ruthless talent for negotiation. He and his followers were stateless actors who created a state by inserting themselves into every local conflict and emerging as the indispensable power. They became the new elite by mastering the chaos of the borderland, turning its instability into a ladder for their own ascent. In the Spanish March, the local counts, the ricos hombres or rich men, operated with similar autonomy. Appointed by Carolingian kings to guard the Pyrenean frontier, they were thousands of miles from the royal court. To defend their counties, they needed to raise their own armies, levy their own taxes, and make their own deals with the powerful Islamic Taifas to their south. Over generations, these counts of Barcelona, Urgell, and Pallars became dynastic rulers in all but name. Their primary identity shifted from Frankish governor to something new, a Catalan lord whose interests were firmly rooted in the geography of the March. They brokered peace treaties, ransomed captives, and controlled the lucrative trade flowing over the mountain passes. Their power came from their role as the essential link between the Christian North and the Islamic South, a position they leveraged to build their own independent principalities. The common thread for all these frontier elites was their control of the channels of exchange. They did not just control land, they controlled movement, the flow of goods, information, and people across the border. They taxed the caravans, they decided who could pass through their fortified valleys, and they held the keys to communication between empires. This made them invaluable to distant sovereigns who needed things from the other side but lacked the local connections to get them. A Byzantine emperor might need intelligence on Arab troop movements, and only the Akrites on the frontier could provide it. A pope might need a tough, reliable military force to intervene in Italy, and only a Norman warlord like Guiscard could supply it. Their loyalty was always negotiable, a fact that made central authorities deeply suspicious but utterly dependent on them. These brokers lived in a world of calculated ambiguity, where oaths of fealty were balanced against family ties across the frontier and the immediate needs of survival. They crafted identities that were deliberately composite, able to present one face to the empire and another to their local constituents. In doing so, they did more than just profit from the borderland. They became its living embodiment, and their rise to power permanently altered the political landscape, proving that the most dangerous figure to an empire was often not the foreign enemy, but the indispensable servant on the very edge of its control. Gold, silk, and spices were not the only cargo moving along the great trade routes. The arteries of commerce that pulsed through the borderlands carried something far more transformative, the living breath of cultures in conversation. These were not simple lines on a map connecting one pure civilization to another. They were the very bloodstream of the hybrid world, and they flowed directly through the heart of the frontier. The legendary Silk Roads were the ultimate example, a sprawling network of overland trails and oasis towns linking China to the Mediterranean. But to see them merely as a conduit for luxury goods is to miss their true nature. Each caravan stop, each bustling oasis city like Samarkand or Bukhara, was itself a miniature borderland. Here, Chinese merchants met Persian traders, who dealt with Indian intermediaries who negotiated with Byzantine officials. The languages spoken in the market were a symphony of difference, and the currencies exchanged bore the faces of emperors and kings who had never met. This constant daily interaction did more than move silk westward and glass eastward. It created a shared mercantile culture, a system of credit and trust evolved that transcended any single empire's law. A merchant from Venice could extend credit to a partner in Tabriz based on a paper contract, a concept that would help birth modern finance. The route itself demanded adaptation. The hybrid technologies of the camel saddle and the caravanserai, the fortified in that offered shelter to every traveler regardless of faith or origin. These were the innovations of the borderland, born from the necessity of connection. On the river roads of Eastern Europe, the Volga trade route served a similar purpose, connecting the silver-rich Islamic world to the fur and honey lands of the Norse and Slavs. Cities like Bulgar and Itil became melting pots where Arab dirhams were weighed against bundles of sable pelts, and where the religious practices of Muslims, pagans, and Christians jostled in the same crowded wharves. The Mediterranean, too, was less a barrier than a liquid highway of exchange. Its sea lanes connected the Islamic ports of Al-Andalus and North Africa with the Christian cities of Italy and Byzantium, carrying olive oil, grain, textiles, and books in a continuous reciprocal flow. In all these spaces, trade was the engine of blending, but it required a special kind of person to keep it running. Certain communities, often existing on the social edges of larger empires, became the indispensable lubricants of this system. Armenian merchants, with networks stretching from the Caspian Sea to the courts of Western Europe, acted as neutral brokers between Byzantine, Islamic, and Mongol powers. Jewish traders and scholars, particularly a legendary group known as the Radhanites, operated a truly global network from the 9th to 11th centuries. Historical accounts describe them traveling from France to China, fluent in multiple languages, dealing in spices, jewels, and manuscripts, and moving seamlessly across the Christian, Islamic, and pagan worlds. Their diaspora existence gave them a unique advantage. They had trusted kin in every port and oasis, creating a web of reliability that no single kingdom could match. Later, Italian merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa would establish their own trading colonies or fondocos in ports from Alexandria to Constantinople to the Crimea, acting as middlemen between East and West. These communities were more than just economic actors, they were living archives and transmission belts. A Jewish physician traveling with a Radhanite caravan might carry a medical text from Baghdad to Cordoba. An Armenian merchant might explain the principles of a new water-lifting device he saw in Persia to a Hungarian noble. A Genos trader in the Crimean port of Kaffa would not only ship silks, but also bring news of political upheavals in the Mongol Khanates to eager listeners in Rome. They carried the seeds of ideas, technologies, and artistic styles, planting them in new soil wherever their networks reached. It is no coincidence, then, that the greatest cities of the medieval world were almost all borderland metropolises, positioned precisely at these crossroads of exchange. Constantinople was the golden clasp between Europe and Asia, where the wealth of the Silk Roads met the naval power of the Mediterranean. Its markets teemed with goods and peoples from 3 continents, and its imperial court blended Roman ceremony, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology into a unique whole. Cordoba, under the Umayyads, became the intellectual capital of the West because it sat at the nexus of trade routes bringing knowledge from Baghdad, goods from Africa, and scholars from across the Christian North. Kiev controlled the Dnieper River route, the main highway between the Baltic and Byzantium, its wealth built on the flow of furs, slaves, and silver. And Norman Palermo thrived because its rulers actively fostered a trilingual administration that could manage trade with Fatimid Egypt, the Byzantine Empire, and the Italian city-states. These cities did not become cosmopolitan in spite of their borderland position. They became brilliant because of it. Their wealth, their intellectual ferment, and their stunning art were direct products of the constant influx of people, goods, and ideas that only a thriving crossroads could provide. The marketplace was the true parliament of the borderland, a place where difference was not a barrier to business, but its very foundation, and where the simple, human act of trade quietly wove the disparate threads of the world into a single, intricate tapestry. But what did all this blending mean for the most intimate unit of society, the family? In the stable heartlands of an empire, social rules were often rigid, passed down through generations. Yet on the frontier, where survival itself depended on flexibility, the very structures of kinship and gender could bend and adapt in remarkable ways. Here, the family was not just a private refuge, it was a strategic asset, a living bridge between worlds. Intermarriage was perhaps the most powerful tool of frontier diplomacy. When a Norse warlord married the daughter of a Gaelic king in Ireland, he was not merely taking a wife, he was securing a political alliance, gaining local legitimacy, and weaving his lineage into the fabric of the land. Their children would inherit claims to both Norse fleets and Gaelic pastures, their very blood embodying the new hybrid reality. This was a calculated strategy, repeated across countless borderlands. In the Crusader states of Outremer, Frankish noblemen, chronically outnumbered, frequently married Armenian or Byzantine Christian noblewomen. These unions did more than produce heirs, they granted the Frankish elite crucial local knowledge, access to regional networks of power, and a veneer of legitimacy in the eyes of their diverse subjects. The family became a miniature peace treaty, a biological and social fusion that stabilized a precarious rule. For women in these societies, the frontier could sometimes offer a different landscape of possibility. While far from modern equality, the constant need for capable management in a dangerous, mobile environment could shift certain norms. In some Norse-Gaelic settlements, runestones and legal fragments suggest women might hold property more independently, especially when their husbands were away on long voyages or campaigns. In the fluid, early years of the Iberian Reconquista, a woman in a frontier town might be expected to help defend the family homestead, giving her a recognized role in its preservation that could translate into greater informal authority within the household. The legal pluralism of border zones could also create unexpected openings. a woman's status might be judged differently under Norse customary law than under Frankish feudal law, and in the gaps between these systems, savvy individuals and families could negotiate for advantage. The most enduring social structures, however, were the vast kinship networks that quietly stretched across political divides. A merchant family might have branches in a Christian port, a Muslim city, and a pagan trading post, all connected by blood and mutual profit. These were the original international corporations, bound not by paperwork but by familial obligation. A cousin in Cairo could vouch for a brother arriving in Palermo, securing credit and safe passage. A marriage alliance between a Bulgarian noble family and a Byzantine aristocratic clan created a channel for communication and influence that bypassed official diplomacy entirely. When a Mongol princess married a Rus prince, she brought with her an entire retinue, creating a small court within a court that maintained ties back to the steppe for generations. These cross-border families became the hidden wiring of the medieval world, transmitting not just genes but trust, information, and cultural practices. They softened the hard edges of political conflict, as a lord might hesitate to raid a territory where his own niece lived as the wife of a local chieftain. The family in the Borderland was transformed from a closed unit into an open network, its branches reaching across rivers and mountains to tether disparate worlds together. In this light, the personal was profoundly political. The choice of a spouse, the inheritance of a child, the obligation to a distant cousin, these were the quiet, daily mechanisms that built the hybrid cultures of the frontier, stitch by intimate stitch. The creative energy of the borderland always existed beside a darker, more dangerous reality. For every moment of exchange and intermarriage, there were periods of brutal rejection, when the very fluidity that defined the frontier became a source of fear and a target for violence. To see these spaces only as zones of harmony is to miss their full, tragic complexity. They were also pressure cookers where identities could harden, where the hybrid figure, the ultimate product of the borderland, could be denounced as a traitor by purists on every side. The same roads that carried silk and scholars could also march armies fueled by a terrifying certainty. The Crusades, launched from the heart of Latin Christendom, represent perhaps the most extreme rejection of the borderland's logic. While knights in Outremer might adopt local customs for practical survival, the ideology that sent them east was one of stark, uncompromising division. Preachers framed the journey as a sacred war to reclaim pure Christian spaces from an infidel other, a narrative that deliberately erased centuries of nuanced coexistence. This rhetoric could ignite horrific violence, as seen in the attacks on Jewish communities in the Rhineland by some crusading bands even before they reached the Holy Land. These were not borderland phenomena, but eruptions of a core ideology that saw the very existence of the other as a pollution to be cleansed, a direct assault on the creative ambiguity of the frontier. Within the borderlands themselves, this hardening of identities often surfaced during moments of political crisis or renewed religious fervor. In Al-Andalus, periods of relative conviventure were punctuated by the rise of puritanical reform movements like the Almoravids and later the Almohads, who swept in from North Africa. These dynasties viewed the cultural blending of Andalusian society as a dangerous dilution of Islamic purity. They imposed stricter interpretations of law, and historical accounts note they placed greater pressures on religious minorities, leading some Jewish and Christian communities to flee north. This was a rejection from within, a reminder that the borderlands experiment was always vulnerable to a resurgence of rigid orthodoxy. The chroniclers of the age, often writing to flatter a king or a caliph, played a powerful role in reinforcing these divisions. They crafted histories that emphasized clear ethnic and religious lines, portraying their own side as virtuous and divinely favored while caricaturing the other. A Norse saga might depict a Gaelic king as a cunning trickster, while an Irish chronicle could portray a Norse settler as a mindless brute. These were not accurate portraits of neighbors who traded and intermarried, but political tools, stories designed to rally a sense of us versus them in times of conflict. They created lasting stereotypes that could be revived to justify violence generations later. For the individuals who embodied the blend, life could be perilously ambiguous. A Mozarabic Christian in Al-Andalus, fluent in Arabic and dressed in the local style, might be viewed with deep suspicion by a newly arrived Christian king from the north, who saw him as tainted by foreign ways. A baptized Saxon noble serving a Frankish margrave could be caught between worlds, never fully trusted by his Frankish overlords and seen as a collaborator by his Saxon kin. The ultimate borderland figure, the translator or the diplomat, always risked being accused of dual loyalty. Their very skill, their ability to navigate multiple worlds, made them indispensable in times of peace but dangerously suspect in times of war. Their fate reminds us that the borderland was not a safe space, but a contested one, where the price of a blended identity could be alienation from all sides. This tension between blending and rejection, between open exchange and violent purification, is the true heartbeat of the frontier. It prevents us from romanticizing the past. The cultural fusions we admire in art and architecture were not created in a climate of perpetual tolerance, but were often hard-won achievements, delicate structures built in the shadow of potential conflict. They existed because, for long stretches of time, the practical benefits of coexistence outweighed the impulse toward division. But that balance was always fragile, and its occasional, violent breakdown is an essential part of the story, teaching us that the path of mixing is never a straight line, but a winding road marked by both brilliant creation and profound loss. The most powerful ideas from the frontier never remained at the edges. They traveled, seeping back into the heart of empires to reshape what it meant to belong to them entirely. The cultural currents that flowed through borderlands like Al-Andalus or the Roman limes did not simply lap at the shores of civilization. They eventually flooded the core, altering its very landscape from within. This is the final and perhaps most profound lesson of the borderland. It was not a sideshow, but the primary source of renewal, even when that renewal looked at first like decline. Consider the Roman army at its height, a legendary force of disciplined legionaries marching in perfect unison under the eagle standard. This was the image of Rome, solid, unchanging, and Roman to its core. Yet by the 4th and 5th centuries, that army had transformed almost beyond recognition. The heavy infantry legion was no longer the undisputed master of the battlefield. In its place stood armies built around elite cavalry, the cataphracts, clad in full chainmail, and mobile units of allied federate troops. The tactics, the equipment, and even the high command had changed. Why? Because the lessons of 300 years of frontier life had finally been fully absorbed. The empire had spent centuries recruiting soldiers from beyond the Rhine and Danube, men who brought their own martial traditions. It had fought countless battles against swift, horse-borne adversaries on the eastern steppes. The borderland, with its hybrid military culture, had been experimenting with these forms for generations. What seemed like a barbarization of the Roman army was, in reality, the logical endpoint of borderland logic. The empire had finally adopted the most effective tools of its own periphery to survive. The general Stilicho, who defended the Western Empire in its final decades, was himself of Vandal ancestry, a product of that blended frontier world now commanding at the highest level. The core identity of Romanness itself stretched to include him. This was not the empire falling, it was the empire transforming, its military soul remade by the very forces it had long managed on its edges. A similar but intellectual revolution was brewing in Western Europe centuries later, and its source was another borderland. For generations, scholars in the monasteries of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire had worked with a limited set of ancient texts, fragments of Plato and Aristotle filtered through a few late Roman commentators. Their worldview, while profound, was constrained by what had been preserved. Then, beginning in the 12th century, a torrent of new knowledge burst into Latin Christendom. It came from the south, from the borderland of Al-Andalus and the translation workshops of Toledo. Here, scholars rendered into Latin not only the complete works of Aristotle, but also the monumental commentaries of the Islamic philosopher Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes, and the groundbreaking medical texts of Ibn Sina or Avicenna. They translated Persian works on algebra, Indian treatises on mathematics using the numeral system we call Arabic, and astronomical tables refined in Baghdad and Cordoba. This was not a trickle of exotic ideas, it was an intellectual dam break. The effect was explosive. Suddenly, European philosophers like Thomas Aquinas were grappling with a rational, comprehensive system of thought that challenged and enriched Christian theology. The very tools of logic and scientific inquiry were sharpened. Universities in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna were electrified by debates over these new texts. The recovery of Aristotle via Arabic translation did not just add to medieval European thought, it fundamentally restructured it, giving rise to scholasticism, a new way of reconciling faith and reason that would dominate intellectual life for centuries. The core of Latin Christendom was undergoing a radical upgrade, and the source code came directly from a borderland civilization it had often defined itself against. This is the subtle, powerful feedback loop of history. The borderland serves as a laboratory, a space of experimentation free from the rigid orthodoxies of the center. There, through necessity and daily contact, new forms of warfare, new artistic styles, new philosophies, and new technologies are forged from old materials. And when these experiments prove successful, when they demonstrate undeniable power or utility, they are inevitably imported back to the core. The periphery teaches the center how to change. The barbarian fighting style becomes the imperial standard. The infidel's philosophy becomes the foundation for a new Christian synthesis. The hybrid identity, once confined to the march, eventually becomes the new face of the empire itself. The borderland does not just sit at the edge of the story, it writes the next chapter for everyone. The vibrant tapestry of the borderland was not woven to last forever. For all their creativity, these zones of mixing were inherently unstable, caught between competing powers whose own strength and ambitions were always shifting. The very forces that gave them life, political ambiguity and cultural exchange, could also lead to their end. Over centuries, many of these dynamic frontiers ceased to exist, not with a bang, but through a slow, deliberate process of absorption, where the fluid space was either swallowed whole or solidified into a rigid new line on the map. One path to this end was complete conquest and cultural overwriting, a fate that befell the pagan Baltic frontier. The crusading project of the Teutonic Knights and the German Ostsiedlung was not designed to create a lasting hybrid society, but to replace one. Through relentless military pressure, forced conversion, and the settlement of a new population, the old Baltic tribal identities were systematically dismantled. The sacred groves were felled, the native languages marginalized, and the social structure reorganized into a rigid hierarchy with German speakers at the top. What had been a living borderland of conflict and negotiation became, over generations, an absorbed territory, its earlier layers of complexity buried beneath a new, imported order. The local spirit of the place was not blended but subdued, leaving behind a landscape where the only remaining border was the internal one between ruler and ruled. A different yet equally final conclusion came to the Iberian Peninsula with the completion of the Reconquista. For centuries, Al-Andalus had been the supreme example of convivencia, a borderland where identities were layered and negotiated. But with the fall of Granada in 1492, the last Muslim ruler surrendered the keys to the city to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. This military victory was followed by a decisive ideological closure. The monarchs issued the Alhambra decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews from their kingdoms. Soon after, Muslims were given the choice of conversion or exile. The goal was no longer coexistence but religious uniformity. The delicate, centuries-old social contract was torn up. Mosques were converted into churches and Arabic manuscripts were burned. The fluid borderland, which had once stretched across the peninsula, hardened into a stark religious boundary, then vanished entirely as that boundary was pushed right off the map. The complex identities of Mozarabs and Muwalladun were no longer tenable, forced into the binary boxes of Orthodox Christian or exiled other. The space for mixing was legislated out of existence, replaced by a singular vision of a pure Catholic Spain. But perhaps the most profound force that ended the age of the medieval borderland was the slow gathering power of the centralized nation-state. Emerging from the feudal patchwork of the late Middle Ages, these new political entities like France, England, and later Spain sought to consolidate their power. They did this by demanding undivided loyalty from their subjects and by drawing fixed, defensible borders on maps. Ambiguity was the enemy of the state. A lord whose loyalty was split between a local frontier interest and a distant king was a problem to be solved. The solution was to nationalize the border, to turn the living zone into a surveyed line, guarded by a royal army that answered only to the crown. This project required the invention of a homogeneous national identity. Monarchs promoted a standard language, often the dialect of the capital, over regional tongues. They commissioned official histories that told a linear, singular story of the nation's origins, erasing the messy, hybrid past in favor of a myth of ancient, pure unity. The complex legacy of a place like Normandy with its Norse-Frankish roots or the Danelaw with its Anglo-Scandinavian blend was smoothed over into a simpler tale of Englishness or Frenchness. The borderland's greatest strength, its layered identity, was recast as a weakness, a sign of divided allegiance that the modern state could not tolerate. In this new world, a person was meant to have one passport, speak one official language, and belong to one nation. The rich, contradictory, and creative reality of the frontier, where a man could be a subject of two kings or a speaker of three tongues, became an artifact of a bygone era, a complexity sacrificed on the altar of administrative order and national myth. The maps grew neater, the stories simpler, but something vital, the creative friction of the in-between space, was lost. The maps were redrawn, but the echoes never faded. The legacy of those medieval borderlands is written into us, into the very names we carry and the languages we speak. Look at the map of Europe today, and you are looking at a parchment layered over those ancient frontiers. The linguistic border between Romance and Germanic languages in Switzerland follows the old limes of the Roman Empire. The vibrant, distinct culture of Catalonia grew directly from the autonomy of the Spanish March, its language a unique blend of Vulgar Latin and Occitan forged on that frontier. The complex ethnic tapestry of the Balkans, with its mix of Orthodox, Catholic, and Muslim communities, bears the lasting imprint of centuries where Byzantine, Ottoman, and Hungarian spheres of influence overlapped and clashed. These are not ancient relics, they are living identities, shaped in the crucible of the borderland and passed down through generations, a testament to how the creative friction of the past defines the cultural landscape of the present. Our modern world, for all its technology, still operates on these ancient principles of contact. We call it globalization now, a network of digital and economic highways, but the human dynamics are strikingly familiar. A global city like London or Dubai is a modern Palermo, a hub where hundreds of languages are spoken, where culinary traditions blend on a single street, and where new hybrid cultural forms, from music to fashion, are born daily in the neighborhoods where communities meet. The modern migrant, navigating life between a homeland and a new country, is engaged in the same delicate act of identity negotiation as a Mozarabic Christian or a Norse settler in Dublin, code switching between worlds and forging a sense of self that belongs to more than one place. Even our contemporary border regions, from the United States-Mexico frontier to the shifting boundaries in parts of Eastern Europe, replay the old scripts of the march, zones where political lines clash with deep cultural and economic connections, where smuggling and trade exist side by side, and where border patrols have replaced the watchtowers of the Akrati. The tensions between assimilation and cultural preservation, between open exchange and fears of dilution, are the same debates that echoed through the halls of Cordoba and the fortresses of the Thughur. Understanding the medieval borderland, therefore, is not an escape into the past. It is a key to deciphering our own fragmented, interconnected world. It teaches us that cultural purity is a myth, that identities are not discovered but built, often in the challenging, fertile spaces between worlds. It shows us that the most resilient societies have often been those, like Norman Sicily or Al-Andalus at its best, that learn to manage difference not by eliminating it, but by creating structures that allowed multiple truths to coexist. And it offers a humbling, long-term perspective on conflict, reminding us that the lines we fight over today are often the scars of yesterday's negotiations, temporary arrangements frozen in time. The story of the borderland is ultimately a story of human creativity under pressure. It tells us that when cultures meet, the result is never simple subtraction, but a complex, often beautiful, mathematics of addition and transformation. The medieval world, so often imagined as static and isolated, was in fact a seething network of these creative frontiers, and we, its distant heirs, are still living with the rich, complicated, and endlessly fascinating consequences. So the maps were redrawn, but the echoes never faded. The legacy of those medieval borderlands is written into us, into the very names we carry and the languages we speak. Look at the map of Europe today, and you are looking at a parchment layered over those ancient frontiers. The linguistic border between Romance and Germanic languages in Switzerland follows the old limes of the Roman Empire. The vibrant, distinct culture of Catalonia grew directly from the autonomy of the Spanish March, its language a unique blend of Vulgar Latin and Occitan forged on that frontier. The complex ethnic tapestry of the Balkans, with its mix of Orthodox, Catholic, and Muslim communities, bears the lasting imprint of centuries where Byzantine, Ottoman, and Hungarian spheres of influence overlapped and clashed. These are not ancient relics, they are living identities, shaped in the crucible of the borderland and passed down through generations, a testament to how the creative friction of the past defines the cultural landscape of the present. Our modern world, for all its technology, still operates on these ancient principles of contact. We call it globalization now, a network of digital and economic highways, but the human dynamics are strikingly familiar. A global city like London or Dubai is a modern Palermo, a hub where hundreds of languages are spoken, where culinary traditions blend on a single street, and where new hybrid cultural forms, from music to fashion, are born daily in the neighborhoods where communities meet. The modern migrant, navigating life between a homeland and a new country, is engaged in the same delicate act of identity negotiation as a Mozarabic Christian or a Norse settler in Dublin, code switching between worlds and forging a sense of self that belongs to more than one place. Even our contemporary border regions, from the United States-Mexico frontier to the shifting boundaries in parts of Eastern Europe, replay the old scripts of the march, zones where political lines clash with deep cultural and economic connections, where smuggling and trade exist side by side, and where border patrols have replaced the watchtowers of the Akrati. The tensions between assimilation and cultural preservation, between open exchange and fears of dilution, are the same debates that echoed through the halls of Cordoba and the fortresses of the Thughur. Understanding the medieval borderland, therefore, is not an escape into the past. It is a key to deciphering our own fragmented, interconnected world. It teaches us that cultural purity is a myth, that identities are not discovered but built, often in the challenging, fertile spaces between worlds. It shows us that the most resilient societies have often been those, like Norman Sicily or Al-Andalus at its best, that learn to manage difference not by eliminating it, but by creating structures that allowed multiple truths to coexist. And it offers a humbling, long-term perspective on conflict, reminding us that the lines we fight over today are often the scars of yesterday's negotiations, temporary arrangements frozen in time. The story of the borderland is ultimately a story of human creativity under pressure. It tells us that when cultures meet, the result is never simple subtraction, but a complex, often beautiful, mathematics of addition and transformation. The medieval world, so often imagined as static and isolated, was in fact a seething network of these creative frontiers, and we, its distant heirs, are still living with the rich, complicated, and endlessly fascinating consequences. From the foggy Roman walls to the sun-drenched courtyards of Al-Andalus, we have traveled across a world that refuses to fit into the neat boxes on a map. This journey reveals a fundamental truth: the borderlands of empire were never marginal backwaters. They were the central engines of historical change, the vibrant workshops where the medieval world was constantly remade. The blending and transformation of cultures was not a rare exception. It was a dominant creative force, producing some of the era's most dynamic societies and its most enduring legacies. The hybrid kingdoms, the translated texts, the architectural masterpieces, and the very languages we speak all stand as monuments to this relentless, generative process of meeting and mixing. To study these spaces is to challenge the simplistic story of civilizational clash, of pure cultures destined for conflict. Instead, we find a more human and more hopeful narrative, one defined by adaptation, by pragmatic exchange, and by a profound capacity for synthesis. It is a story not of walls but of bridges built in the most unlikely places. If this exploration has reshaped how you see the past, consider diving deeper. The history of the borderland is vast, and every region, from the Silk Road to the African Sahel, holds its own chapters of extraordinary blending. Your curiosity is the next frontier. Thank you for watching.